The static crackle of the deputy's radio cut through the humid Missouri air, a sound as thick and heavy as the swarm of cicadas buzzing in the oak trees. Sheriff's Deputy Miller, a young man whose uniform was already dark with sweat under. The August sun cleared his throat. He held a stiff, official-looking document in his hand, the paper already starting to wilt. Across from him stood Brenda Mae Thompson, president of the Blackwater Estates Homeowners Association, her back ramrod straight, a smirk playing on her lips. She thought she knew what this was about. She'd made the call herself. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair didn't move an inch as she glanced over at Jack Callahan, who stood silently beside his rust-pocked Ford Ranger. She expected to see fear in his eyes, maybe a flicker of panicked defiance. Instead, she saw a calm that was more unsettling than any outburst. It was the unnerving stillness of a predator waiting for the trap to spring. Deputy Miller, looking deeply uncomfortable, avoided everyone's gaze and read from the document. "This notice, effective immediately," he began, his voice flat, "is a legal order to vacate the premises." Brenda's smirk widened into a triumphant grin. She'd finally done it. The illegal boat, the insubordination, the sheer gall of that man to defy her, it was all coming to an end. "It's about time," she said, her voice like honey-coated gravel. "This community has rules, and Mr. Callahan here seems to think they don't apply to him." The deputy didn't look up. He took a slow step forward, not toward Jack's dilapidated cabin, but toward the grand, cedar-planked entrance of the Blackwater Estates Community Fishing Club, Brenda's pride and joy. He affixed the notice to the heavy oak door with a staple gun that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. The world seemed to stop. Brenda's smile froze, then melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. "Deputy, what in God's name are you doing?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "That's for him." The deputy finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of pity and official duty. He tapped the header on the document. "Ma'am, this eviction notice isn't for Mr. Callahan. It's for the Blackwater Estates HOA Fishing Club." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the oppressive heat. "According to the owner of this property, you're trespassing." Brenda stared, her mouth agape, her eyes darting from the notice on her beloved clubhouse door to the quiet, unmoving man by the truck. The takedown hadn't just begun. The foundation of her entire kingdom had just been exposed as sand, and the tide was coming in. "Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far this kind of HOA power reaches." The war didn't start with a legal notice. It started with the gentle lapping of water against a dented aluminum hull. 2 months earlier, Jack Callahan had returned to his grandfather's cabin on Blackwater Lake with little more than 3 duffel bags, a service-issued honorable discharge, and a silence that had settled deep in his bones after 2 tours in the mountains of Afghanistan. He was an Army Ranger trained in reconnaissance and quiet lethality, but all he wanted now was the quiet of the Ozarks. The smell of pine needles baking in the sun, the taste of cheap coffee on the porch as the morning mist burned off the water. This was the therapy no VA doctor could prescribe. The cabin was exactly as he remembered it from childhood summers. The scent of cedar and old books, the worn leather armchair facing the lake, the stone fireplace still holding the faint aroma of 1,000 fires. His grandfather, a surveyor by trade and a hermit by choice, had left him the cabin, the 5 acres. It sat on, and a legacy of fierce independence. The first month was about reconnecting with the land, fixing the leaky roof and clearing the overgrown path to the private dock his grandfather had built with his own hands 50 years ago. The second month, he bought the boat. It wasn't much, a asau. 20-foot sun tracker pontoon with faded blue upholstery and an engine that coughed to life like an old man waking from a nap. But to Jack, it was a vessel of freedom. Out on the water, the dull ringing in his ears would fade, replaced by the thrum of the 2-stroke motor and the cry of a distant hawk. He was conducting his own kind of recon, mapping the geography of his own piece. The first shot across the bow arrived not by boat, but by mail. It was a crisp, cream-colored envelope tucked into the rusty mailbox at the end of his gravel drive. The return address read, Blackwater Estates Architectural Review Committee. Inside, the letter was polite in that venomously passive-aggressive way only a bureaucracy can master. It informed him of a violation of Covenant 12, Section B, unapproved watercraft. The photo, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from across the cove, showed his humble pontoon boat tied to his private dock. The fine was $50 per day, retroactive to the day the boat was first observed. Jack read it twice, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. He was used to dealing with threats, but they usually came from men with AK-47s, not a committee with a letterhead. He tossed the notice onto the kitchen table. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. Stick with me. He decided to handle it directly, a tactic learned in hostile territory. Walk straight toward the threat. The HOA office was a sterile, air-conditioned room in the community clubhouse, a building that looked jarringly new and corporate against the ancient rolling hills. And there, behind a large mahogany desk, sat the source of the threat, Brenda Mae Thompson. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a crisp linen pantsuit that probably cost more than his boat. Her smile was wide and bright, but it didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. Her manicured hand rested on a thick leather binder labeled Covenants and Bylaws. Mr. Callahan, she cooed, as if he were a long-lost nephew and not a target. So glad you came in. We do prefer to handle these little matters face-to-face. It's more neighborly. Jack didn't smile back. There's been a mistake. I got a notice about my boat. Oh, no mistake, she said, her smile tightening. Covenant 12 is very clear. All watercraft must be approved by the Committee for Aesthetic Harmony. Pontoon boats especially, older models, tend to detract from the prestige lakeside experience we cultivate here. The air in the room was thick with the scent of her cloying perfume and the faint chemical smell of fresh carpet. Jack felt the concrete walls closing in, a world away from the open air of his porch. Ma'am, with all due respect, that's my private dock on my private property. My grandfather built it before this HOA ever existed. Brenda tapped a perfectly polished nail on the binder. When you live in a planned community, Mr. Callahan, the concept of private property has certain shared responsibilities. The rules apply to everyone. Uniformity protects property values. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to the low, steady cadence he used when things were about to get serious. I'm not part of your planned community. My property was never signed into the HOA. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. A clerical error, I'm sure. Your property falls within the geographic boundaries of Blackwater Estates. The rules apply. That's when Jack dropped his first small tactical munition. He'd spent the previous night doing his own reconnaissance online, a digital patrol through Missouri state law. Actually, he said calmly, according to Missouri Statute 448-4116, any fines levied by an HOA are unenforceable unless the homeowner is first given notice and an opportunity for a formal hearing. This letter, he pulled the crumpled notice from his back pocket and laid it on her desk, is a bill, not an invitation to a hearing. Legally, it's just a piece of paper. The silence that followed was heavy. Brenda's mask of neighborly concern slipped, revealing a flash of raw, indignant anger. Her face flushed a pale pink. She was not used to being challenged, especially not with facts. She snatched the paper off the desk. This is a courtesy notice, she hissed, recovering quickly. The hearing can be arranged, but the violation stands. The fine stands. Move the boat, Mr. Callahan, or we'll have it moved for you. It was a direct threat, And in that moment, Jack knew this wasn't about a boat. This was about control. This isn't just my fight, it's yours too. Tell me if your HOA has ever crossed the line. The letters kept coming. Each day a new cream-colored envelope, the fines accumulating with interest. Then the observation started. Through the spotting scope he still had from the service, Jack saw her. Brenda Mae Thompson, standing on the sprawling deck of her waterfront mansion across the cove, binoculars pressed to her eyes. She was watching him. It wasn't just a legal dispute anymore. It was personal. It was surveillance. She was treating his home like an enemy encampment. One evening, he was cleaning a few freshly caught bass on his dock when an old pickup truck rumbled down his driveway. The man who got out was wiry and weathered, with kind eyes and a handshake, like worn leather. His name was Gus, and he lived on the next road over. He'd known Jack's grandfather. Saw the boat, Gus said, nodding toward the pontoon. Figured it wouldn't be long before the dragon lady sent her regards. Brenda? Jack asked. Gus chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. That's the one. She runs this place like her own little fiefdom. Been that way ever since she married County Commissioner Thompson. Thinks his title makes her queen. He sat on the edge of the dock, the wood groaning under his weight. The smell of lake water and night-blooming jasmine hung in the air. Your granddad, he never would have put up with her. He owned his land free and clear, long before they drew up the plans for this subdivision. He told them all to go to hell when they came asking him to join their little club. Gus explained the history. The developer had bought up hundreds of acres of old farmland and forest in the 90s, carving it into quarter-acre lots for wealthy retirees from St. Louis and Kansas City. Jack's grandfather's property and a few others belonging to Original. Local families were like islands in the middle of the HOA's territory. For years, the HOA had been trying to squeeze them out, using a campaign of petty fines, legal threats, and social pressure. They want it all, Gus said, his voice low. They especially want the waterfront lots that aren't under their control. It messes with their aesthetic harmony. As they talked, looking over the yellowing property survey Jack's grandfather had framed on the wall, Gus tapped a finger on the blue expanse marked Blackwater Lake. You know, he said, squinting, my daddy used to tell me stories. Said the fella who owned all this land back in the 40s sold off the parcels for farming and timber. But he was real particular about the water. Something about keeping the rights to it. That's when Jack felt the second piece of the puzzle click into place. He'd been focused on the land, on his property line. He hadn't thought about the water. He knew about mineral rights from his time in places where oil was more valuable than blood, but he'd never considered water rights. Under property law, riparian rights, the rights to use and access a body of water, can sometimes be deeded and owned completely separately from the adjacent land. The HOA's covenants governed the lots, the physical parcels of dirt. But what if their authority stopped at the water's edge? What if they had absolutely no jurisdiction over the lake itself? What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. The conversation with Gus lit a fire in him. This was no longer a defensive action. It was time to go on the offensive. He transitioned from soldier at peace to intelligence operative. The target was Brenda Thompson and the Blackwater Estates HOA. The objective was total victory. His grandfather's attic became his command center. The air up there was thick with the smell of dust, aging paper, and sun-baked cedar. Wasps buzzed lazily against the single, grimy window pane. He spent 2 days digging through steamer trunks and cardboard boxes filled with his grandfather's life. He found old photographs, tax returns from 1968, and stacks of meticulously drafted survey maps. His grandfather, the surveyor, had been a record keeper. Every document was dated, every boundary line drawn with a steady, confident hand. Jack's fingers, dusty and stained with age, flipped through brittle deeds and titles. He found the deed for his 5-acre lot, just as expected. He found the original plat map for the entire county, predating the Blackwater Estates subdivision by decades. His grandfather's parcel was clearly marked, a stubborn, irregular shape amidst what would become a grid of perfect rectangles. And then he found it. Tucked inside a heavy oilcloth envelope was a separate document, a quitclaim deed from 1947. The paper was heavy, the typewritten script faded but legible. It wasn't a deed for land. It was a deed for the entire submerged bed, surface, and column of the body of water known as Blackwater Lake, including all littoral and riparian rights appurtenant thereto. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs. He read it again, and then a third time. It couldn't be. His grandfather hadn't just owned the cabin on the lake. He had owned the lake, all of it. The whole 300 acres of water, from the muddy bottom to the shimmering surface. His training kicked in. Verify intelligence before acting. He spent the next 4 hours online, cross-referencing the deed number with the county recorder's official digital archives. The screen glowed in the dark attic, illuminating his stunned face. There it was. The deed was legal, filed, and had never been superseded. He discovered a crucial legal principle: severed water rights. In many states, especially where water is a valuable resource, the ownership of a lake or river can be legally severed from the ownership of the shoreline. The HOA, in their arrogance, had built their entire community around a lake they assumed was public or belonged to the development. They had written rules and regulations governing its use, built their multi-million-dollar clubhouse and fishing docks on its shores, and held their annual base fishing tournament on its waters, all without ever checking who actually owned it. They hadn't just built their houses on the land surrounding his property. They had built their entire social and legal structure on his lake. The community fishing dock, the boat ramp they charged non-residents to use, the perfectly manicured beach, it was all trespassing. For 30 years, they had been illegally using and profiting from his family's private property. He picked up his phone, his hand steady. He found the number for a local attorney Gus had mentioned, a man named Ben Carter, who had a reputation for taking on tough cases against powerful people. He explained the situation in calm, measured tones, just as he would deliver a field report. He told him about the boat, the fines, Brenda, the surveillance, and finally the deed from 1947. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jack could hear the faint sound of paper shuffling. Then, a low whistle. "Mr. Callahan," the lawyer said, his voice a sudden cocktail of disbelief, awe, and predatory excitement. "Let me make sure I understand this. You're telling me you hold the deed to the entire lake bed and surface of Blackwater Lake?" "That's what it says," Jack confirmed. Another pause, longer this time. When Ben Carter spoke again, his voice had changed. It was the sound of a shark smelling blood in the water. "Mr. Callahan," he said slowly, savoring each word, "you don't just have a defense against their fines, you own them. They've been operating a commercial enterprise, their fishing club, on your private land for decades. They've built permanent structures on your property without your consent. This isn't just an HOA takedown. This is a reckoning." Jack looked out the attic window at the lake, his lake, shimmering under the moonlight. The pontoon boat, the source of all this trouble, bobbed gently at the dock. It was no longer just a vessel of freedom. It was the catalyst, the first domino, and he was about to push it over. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The phone call with Ben Carter was less a legal consultation and more a pre-mission briefing. Jack sat on his porch, the scent of rain on the hot asphalt of the distant highway hanging in the air, as the lawyer's voice buzzed with an electric energy. "Forget the fines, Jack. The fines are a symptom. The disease is their arrogance. We're not going to parry their little jabs. We're going to launch a strategic strike right at their center of gravity, the clubhouse and the fishing docks." Ben explained the plan. Phase 1 was a formal cease and desist letter, but not the kind Brenda was used to. This one wouldn't mention Covenant 12 or the pontoon boat. It would cite the 1947 deed, include a notarized copy, and formally demand the Blackwater Estates HOA immediately halt all operations on the private property of Jack Callahan, which happened to be the entire lake. It was the legal equivalent of planting a flag behind enemy lines. 2 days later, the letter, delivered by a certified courier, landed like a grenade in Brenda Mae Thompson's mahogany-paneled world. Her reaction was not what Ben had predicted. She didn't lawyer up in a panic. She laughed. At an emergency HOA board meeting, she held up the letter, its pages trembling with her performative indignation. "This is what he's resorted to," she announced to the assembled board of retired executives and dentists. "A desperate, fraudulent document. A pathetic attempt to intimidate us because he doesn't want to follow the same rules as everyone else." The smear campaign began that evening. Emails flew. Whispers started at the community pool. Jack Callahan wasn't just a nonconformist. He was a con artist. A troublemaker trying to extort the community. The narrative was simple, effective, and utterly false. Brenda, shielded by the armor of her husband's political influence, felt untouchable. Her counteroffensive was swift and vicious. It started on a Monday. Another cream-colored envelope appeared, this time with a new, larger fine. The original $50-a-day penalty for the boat was now compounded by a $500 fine for initiating frivolous legal action with malicious intent. They had weaponized their own bylaws against his attempt to seek justice. The next day, Jack was replacing a single rotten plank on his dock when a pristine white county truck pulled into his drive. A man with a clipboard and a sour expression introduced himself as being from the Zoning Commission. He spent an hour walking the property, his eyes scanning for any conceivable violation: the distance of the septic tank from the well, the height of the porch railing, the age of the electrical wiring. It was a transparent act of intimidation. The air was thick with the smell of his truck's diesel exhaust and the unspoken threat that he could find a reason to condemn this place if he looked hard enough. The true escalation happened on Wednesday. Jack woke to a profound and unsettling silence. The gentle, rhythmic lapping of waves against his boat's hull was gone. He walked to the edge of his porch, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The pontoon was gone. His eyes scanned the gray, misty surface of the lake until he saw it, a dim shape drifting aimlessly near the opposite shore, a half-mile away. He ran to the dock. Both mooring ropes, thick nylon braids he had tied himself, had been sliced cleanly, through with a knife. This was no longer about rules or fines. This was a criminal act. Sabotage. The message was clear. We can touch you. We can take what's yours. You are not safe here. A cold fury, the kind he hadn't felt since his last tour, settled over him. This was the terrain he understood. The enemy had escalated from bureaucratic warfare to direct action, and they had made a grave mistake. They had reminded him who he was. Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Let's see how many of us there are. The side of the drifting boat sent a shockwave through the small pocket of original residents. Gus showed up that afternoon, his face a grim mask of worry. He carried a cold six-pack of beer and an expression that said he'd seen this movie before. "She's crossed a line," Gus said, his voice a low rumble, as he watched Jack coil the retrieved, severed ropes. "This is what she does. Pushes and pushes until people break." He told Jack about the Martinez family, who had lived in a small cabin 2 coves over for 40 years. Brenda had waged a 2-year war against them over the shade of beige they'd painted their mailbox. The fines piled up, followed by liens on their property, until the elderly couple, broken and buried in legal fees, had been forced to sell to a developer friend of Brenda's husband. "She doesn't just want conformity, son," Gus said, his gaze fixed on Brenda's mansion across the water. "She wants eradication. She wants this whole lake to be her perfect, polished reflection." In that moment, Jack's fight became about more than his own property. It was for Gus, for the memory of the Martinez family, and for his grandfather, who had stood his ground against this same tide of encroaching entitlement. He wasn't just defending a cabin, he was defending a history. He spent the next 48 hours transforming his property into an intelligence-gathering outpost. Using skills honed in hostile territories, he mounted small, weatherproof surveillance cameras disguised as birdhouses in the trees overlooking his dock and driveway. Every phone call with the HOA or county officials was recorded. He created a meticulous log, documenting every letter, every visit, every act of harassment with dates, times, and photographic evidence. He was no longer just a homeowner, he was building a case file. Then came the move he and Ben hadn't anticipated. The HOA's lawyers, a high-priced firm from Kansas City, filed a stunningly aggressive counterclaim. They sued Jack for slander of title, a legal action claiming his deed was fraudulent and was causing material harm to the community. But the truly vicious part was the motion they filed with it, a temporary restraining order and injunction to prevent Jack from taking any action based on his spurious claim of ownership. They argued to the judge that his threats of eviction were destabilizing the entire community and jeopardizing hundreds of millions of dollars in property values. The judge, a man who played golf with Commissioner Thompson every other Saturday, granted the injunction in less than a day. The legal document Ben read over the phone was a gut punch. Jack was now legally barred from interfering with any HOA activities on the lake. He couldn't evict them. He couldn't put up no trespassing signs. He couldn't even tell the fishing club to get off his dock. They had successfully used the courts to sanction their own trespassing, tying his hands and leaving him exposed while they buried him in legal fees. The ground Jack thought he'd gained had vanished beneath his feet. It was a masterful, brutal maneuver, and for the first time Jack felt a flicker of doubt. "They've put us in a legal kill box, Ben," Jack said, the military metaphor coming naturally. "We're pinned down." Ben Carter's voice on the other end of the line was dangerously calm. "Don't mistake a tactical retreat for a defeat, Jack. Brenda just made the biggest mistake of her life. She thinks she pinned us down. What she actually did was hand us the keys to her entire kingdom." Jack was silent, confused. "By filing a suit for slander of title," Ben explained, his voice rising with excitement, "they've legally initiated what's called a quiet title action. It's a special kind of lawsuit designed to clear up ownership disputes once and for all. To win, they don't just have to prove your deed is fake, they have to prove their claim to the lake is superior. The burden of proof is on them, and their claim is built on thin air. She just kicked a hornet's nest, and more importantly, she just opened the door to legal discovery." The weight of the injunction lifted, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Discovery. It was the legal equivalent of a search warrant for every file, every email, every dirty secret the HOA possessed. Brenda's aggression had been a tactical blunder of catastrophic proportions. She hadn't built a wall. She had opened the gates and invited his army inside. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending. The piece of intelligence that changed the emotional texture of the war came from Gus. During one of their evening strategy sessions on the dock, watching the sunset paint the surface of Jack's lake in strokes of orange and purple, Gus revealed something crucial about Brenda. "You gotta understand," he began, swirling the ice in his glass of whiskey. "For her, this ain't about property values. Not really. It's about that clubhouse." He explained that Brenda's father, a man named Franklin Steiner, had been one of the original developers. He was a hard-charging man who had poured his life savings into the Blackwater Estates project. The fishing club was his passion project. The annual base tournament, the HOA's biggest social event, was named the Steiner Memorial Cup. "That plaque on the front door," Gus said, That's his name on it. She idolized him. When he died, that club became her whole identity. It's how she honors his memory and holds on to her social standing. It's not just a building to her, Jack. It's a shrine. Her entire sense of self-worth is tied up in that place. Suddenly, the antagonist wasn't a generic, power-hungry bureaucrat anymore. She was a woman desperately clinging to her father's legacy, and she was terrified of losing it. Her aggression wasn't just arrogance, it was fear. Her greatest strength, her personal connection to the community's crown jewel, was also her greatest vulnerability. Jack knew exactly where to apply the pressure. The discovery process was a thing of beauty. Ben Carter unleashed a torrent of subpoenas. He demanded every meeting minute for the past 30 years, all financial statements, every internal email that contained the name Callahan. Jack's meticulous documentation of the harassment was now Exhibit A in a binder, 5 inches thick. The depositions were even better. One by one, the board members sat across a table from Ben Carter, sweating under the lights as he dismantled their stories. They admitted the zoning inspector was a family friend of the Thompsons. They admitted there was no formal process for approving the fines. The smoking gun came from a disgruntled former board secretary who provided a chain of emails from Brenda's personal account. One, sent the day after Jack's first visit, read, "We need to make an example of the squatter in the Steiner cabin. Use all available resources. We cannot allow the originals to get any ideas." Another, to her husband, "Can you have your man at the county take a look at the Callahan property? Find something. Anything." They also uncovered a decade of financial mismanagement. The fees the HOA charged non-residents to use the boat ramp on Jack's property were collected in cash and deposited into a social fund, controlled exclusively by Brenda, with no oversight and no records. The takedown was no longer just about property rights. It was now about corruption, abuse of power, and potential fraud. "We have them," Ben said, his office filled with stacks of incriminating documents. "We can drag them through court for 2 years and win. Or," he paused, a sly grin spreading across his face, "we can give them the public execution they deserve." He picked up the phone and dialed Sarah Jenkins, a tenacious investigative reporter for the biggest news station in Springfield, known for her series on small-town corruption. What they did next almost made me lose everything, but it also gave me the win of my life. The night of the annual Steiner Memorial Cup banquet was the apex of the Blackwater Estates social calendar. The clubhouse was glowing, light spilling from its large picture windows onto the perfectly manicured lawn. The sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter drifted across the water. Inside, Brenda Mae Thompson, dressed in a shimmering silver gown, was at the center of it all, the queen in her court. Jack wasn't there. He was parked in his truck with Ben and Sarah Jenkins on a dark, secluded overlook, the clubhouse a glittering jewel box below them. Sarah had spent the week verifying every document, every claim. Her story was written, fact-checked, and loaded onto her station's web server, ready to go live at the push of a button. "They're about to serve the main course," Sarah said, watching the scene through binoculars. "And then we'll serve ours." They watched as Brenda stepped up to the podium to give her annual address. Her voice, amplified by a microphone, carried faintly up the hill. She spoke of community, of shared values, of protecting the legacy her father had built. At exactly 8:15 p.m., as Brenda raised her glass for a toast, Sarah looked at Jack, then at Ben. "Ready?" she asked. They both nodded. She tapped her phone screen. "It's live," she whispered. Down in the banquet hall, the effect was instantaneous and devastating. A single phone lit up, then another, then a dozen more. A low murmur rippled through the elegant crowd. Heads went down, looking at screens, then back up, their expressions shifting from polite attention to confusion, then to open-mouthed shock. People started whispering, pointing, turning to look at Brenda at the podium. Her speech faltered. She saw the faces in her audience, the faces of her friends and allies, twisting with accusation. At that exact moment, the side doors of the banquet hall burst open. The blinding white light of a television camera cut through the dim ballroom atmosphere, followed by a second camera. The reporters, tipped off by Sarah, had arrived. The lights found Brenda, freezing her at the podium like a startled animal. Her smile was gone, replaced by a ghastly mask of horror and disbelief as she finally understood. This wasn't a party. It was an ambush. And her entire world, built on a foundation of lies and legacy, was collapsing around her. Live on the evening news. The flash of the news cameras was a strobe light illuminating a shipwreck. Inside the banquet hall, chaos bloomed. Brenda May. Thompson stood frozen at the podium, her face a pale, horrified mask in the glare. Her husband, the county commissioner, a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room, tried to take control, shouting at the camera crews, but his voice was lost in the rising cacophony of ringing phones and angry whispers. The story Sarah Jenkins had published was spreading through the room like wildfire, passed from screen to screen. Decades of carefully constructed prestige and authority were dissolving in real time. Jack watched from the overlook as the first few residents, their faces grim with betrayal, began walking out. They weren't just leaving a party, they were abandoning a queen. The foundation of Brenda's power had never been the bylaws or her husband's influence. It was the collective belief of the community, and he had just shattered it. The days that followed were a blur of consequences. The local news ran the story on a loop. The state attorney general's office announced an investigation into the HOA's finances and allegations of harassment. 3 board members resigned via email within 24 hours. A supervising judge, citing overwhelming evidence of bad faith and potential malfeasance, issued an emergency order dissolving the injunction against Jack. The legal walls that had boxed him in crumbled to dust. Overnight, the power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. Any other person would have seen the endgame and surrendered. But Brenda's entire identity was interwoven with the legacy of that clubhouse, with the reflection of the powerful woman she saw in the calm waters of the lake. To surrender was not just to lose a legal battle, it was to cease to exist. Against the frantic advice of her own lawyers, she refused to settle. She would fight the quiet title action. She would prove in a court of law that the lake, her lake, belonged to the community. It was the final, fatal act of hubris from a ruler who could not comprehend that her reign was over. The climax didn't come in a grand courtroom filled with spectators. It came in the suffocating silence of a law firm's conference room on a Tuesday morning. This was the deposition, the formal, sworn testimony that would be the backbone of the lawsuit. The air hummed with the low drone of the air conditioning. The room smelled of expensive leather and stale coffee. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat Brenda and her 2 high-priced lawyers. On the other, Jack sat next to Ben Carter, his posture calm, his hands resting on the table. Between them, a court reporter's fingers flew across a stenotype machine, each soft click a hammer blow chipping away at Brenda's crumbling empire. Ben began calmly, his voice even and dispassionate. He walked Brenda through the initial violation notice for the boat. He had her read aloud the threatening letters. He played the audio from the zoning inspector's visit, the man's veiled threats now echoing in the sterile room. With each piece of evidence, a bead of sweat would trace a new path down Brenda's temple. She denied, deflected, and reframed. The fines were standard procedure. The inspector's visit was a routine community service. The cut ropes on Jack's boat were likely vandalism by local teenagers. Her lawyers objected, but Ben was methodical. He was building a foundation, brick by painstaking brick, establishing an undeniable pattern of targeted harassment. Then, he moved to the finances. He produced the bank statements for the social fund, showing years of cash deposits from the boat ramp fees and withdrawals for personal expenses, spa days, political donations, catered parties at her home, Kent. "You explain these withdrawals, Mrs. Thompson?" Ben asked, his voice still infuriatingly calm. "The social fund is discretionary," she snapped, her composure beginning to fray. "It's for community outreach and morale. So a $2,000 charge at a designer boutique in St. Louis was for community morale?" Ben countered, letting the question hang in the air. The clicking of the stenotype machine was the only sound. Brenda's face was flushed, her knuckles white where she gripped her pen. She was losing, and she knew it. But the final, decisive blow had yet to fall. Ben slid a heavy, cloth-bound document across the table. It was the original 1991 Articles of Incorporation for the Blackwater Estates Homeowners Association, procured from the state archives. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "could you please read Article 2, Section 1 for the record?" Her lawyer tried to object, but the judge had compelled full cooperation. With trembling hands, Brenda opened the book. Her voice was a strained whisper. "The authority of this association and all covenants herein shall apply exclusively to those land parcels designated and recorded within the official plat map of the Blackwater Estates subdivision, filed with the county on June 1st, 1991. Ben let the words settle. Then he produced his final exhibit, a large, certified copy of that exact 1991 plat map. He unrolled it on the table. The neat grid of HOA lots was clearly delineated. And there, on the edge, was a glaring white space, an island of exclusion, labeled Callahan Parcel, 5.1 acres. Attached to it, also in the white space outside the HOA's territory, was the entirety of Blackwater Lake. Their own founding document, the very source of their power, explicitly excluded Jack's property and the lake from their jurisdiction. They had built a kingdom on land they had no right to, governed by a charter that proved it. It was a legal checkmate. The room was silent save for Brenda's ragged breathing. She stared at the map, at the stark black and white proof of her delusion. But Ben wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, drawing all the focus in the room. "Ma'am, I'm sure in your extensive study of the HOA's bylaws, you never had reason to look up Missouri Revised Statute 448.2118, did you?" Brenda stared at him blankly. "It's a fascinating piece of legislation," Ben continued, a hint of steel in his voice. "It outlines the process for the administrative dissolution of a homeowners association. It states that upon a petition of a majority of its members, an HOA can be forcibly dissolved by the state if the association is found to have acted in a manner that is illegal, oppressive, or fraudulent." He paused, letting the full weight of those words land. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers, bound with a rubber band. He placed it on the table with a soft, final thud. "This," he said, "is a petition for the immediate dissolution of the Blackwater Estates HOA. It has been signed by homeowners representing over 70% of the residences. It includes the signatures of 4 of your 5 board members. They have also provided sworn affidavits detailing your campaign of harassment against Mr. Callahan and your misappropriation of funds." This was the final, unthinkable blow. He hadn't just taken her lake. He hadn't just exposed her as a fraud. He had taken her entire kingdom. He had armed her own subjects and led a revolution that had wiped her off the map. Brenda Mae Thompson made a small choked sound. The iron mask of her authority shattered, revealing the terrified, humiliated woman beneath. She pushed her chair back, a single tear cutting a clean path through her expensive foundation, and fled the room. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror below and I might cover it. The end was swift. The Blackwater Estates HOA was dissolved by state order a month later. A new voluntary neighborhood watch and road maintenance committee was formed by Gus and other reasonable residents. The Thompson political dynasty came to an ignominious end when the commissioner, facing a recall petition and a state ethics investigation, announced he would not seek re-election. The clubhouse and its surrounding land were turned over to Jack as part of a massive settlement for damages and decades of illegal use of his property. 6 months later, on a perfect May morning, the lake was finally quiet. The incessant buzz of jet skis and the shouts from the community beach were gone. The grand, imposing clubhouse had been dismantled, its foundation now just a concrete scar on the earth that would soon be reclaimed by nature. Jack Callahan was out on the water drifting in the middle of his lake. His lake. He'd had the engine on his pontoon boat tuned and the faded blue upholstery replaced. It hummed along now with a quiet, contented thrum. He wasn't alone. Gus sat in the passenger seat, casting a line into the deep blue water. In the back, laughing as they baited their hooks, were the Martinez couple. Jack had used some of the settlement money to find them in their cramped rental apartment in the city and had bought back their old cabin for them, signing the deed over free and clear. Today was their first day back on the water. Jack leaned back, feeling the warm sun on his face and the gentle rock of the boat beneath him. This boat, the unapproved watercraft, the humble dented vessel that Brenda Thompson had deemed unworthy of her perfect view. It had been the catalyst for the entire war. He looked at the ugly, wonderful, defiant old boat and smiled. It was no longer a symbol of his struggle, but the flagship of his peace. He had won more than a legal victory. He had reclaimed a legacy. He used the bulk of the settlement to establish the Blackwater Lake Conservation Trust, placing the entire 300-acre lake and 100 acres of the surrounding old-growth forest into a permanent protected easement. No one would ever be able to exploit or control it again. His grandfather's fierce independence had been transformed into a permanent sanctuary for everyone. This was his victory. The sound of laughter echoing across the water, the sight of an old family returning home, and the profound, unbreakable silence of a place that was finally, truly free. He had faced down a bully, dismantled a corrupt empire, and healed a small piece of the world, all because they told him where he could and couldn't park his boat. If you believe that no one is above the law and that every person has the right to stand their ground, hit that subscribe button. Let's take down every corrupt HOA together. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it. And remember, sometimes the biggest battles are won not with a shout, but with the quiet discovery of who you are and what you own.